Welcome back. This is the Bookmobile Lady reading The Curious Garden. It's by Peter Brown. It says it's for my curious grandmother, Petey. And the copyright is 2009. There once was a city without gardens, or trees, or greenery of any kind. Most people spent their time indoors. As you can imagine, it was a very dreary place. See all the details? However, there was one boy who loved being outside. Even on drizzly days, while everyone else stayed inside, you could always find Lem happily splashing through his neighborhood. It was on one such morning that Lem made several surprising discoveries. He was wandering around the old railway, as he did from time to time, when he stumbled upon a dark stairwell leading up to the tracks. The railway had stopped working ages ago, and since Lem had always wanted to explore the tracks, there was only one thing for the curious boy to do. And there's the railway. Lem ran up the stairs, pushed open the door, and stepped out onto the railway. The first thing he saw was a lonely patch of color. Wildflowers and plants were the last thing he had expected to find up there. But when he took a closer look, it became clear that the plants were dying. They needed a gardener. Lem may not have been a gardener, but he knew that he could help. So he returned to the railway the very next day and got to work. The flowers nearly drowned, and he had a few pruning problems, but the plants patiently waited for Lem. While Lem found better ways of gardening. He's singing to the plants now. Watering, trimming, and singing. As the weeks rolled by, Lem began to feel like a real gardener, and the plants began to feel like a real garden. Wow, it's a pretty little patch. But most gardens stay in one place. But this was no ordinary garden. With miles of open railway ahead of it, the garden was growing restless. It wanted to explore. The tough little weeds and mosses were the first to move. They popped up further and farther down the tracks and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. See how they spread out along the railway? Over the next few months, Lem and the curious garden explored every corner of the railway. That's what his railway looked like. After spending his spring and summer and autumn with the garden, Lem's time on the railway was finally interrupted by winter. Heavy blankets of snow fell on the city that season. For the first time since he'd become a gardener, Lem could not visit the plants. They were covered. But it looks like he found something else to do. He could go snow sledding. Rather than wasting his winter worrying about the garden, Lem spent it preparing for spring. Maybe he got that book from the library. After 3 cold months, the snow finally began to melt, and Lem rolled his new garden gear over the railway. Winter had taken a toll on the garden. Wow, it looks dead, doesn't it? But thanks to Lem planning his handy new tools and a little help from the sun, the plants soon awoke from the winter sleep. There he is singing again. It's a proven scientific fact that singing and talking to plants helps them grow. The garden had always wanted to explore the rest of the city, and that spring it was finally ready to make its move. Once again, the tough little weeds and mosses set out first. They popped up farther and farther from the railway and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. The garden was especially curious about old, forgotten things. A few plants popped up where they didn't belong. That's not good. It should never cover a stop sign. And it should never cover a fire hydrant. Both of those are dangerous. Others mysteriously popped up all at once. It just popped up in his flower pot. What a surprise. But the most surprising things that popped up were the new gardeners. All these new people had interests in gardening. Look at all the children. The steps were covered. People would come out and take a picnic at lunch. And some bushes were cut into animals, the shape of animals. What an interesting garden. Many years later, the entire city had blossomed, but all the new gardeners, Lem's favorite was where it all began. Wow, his bush really grew. It looks like more like a tree. Now look at the city. What a beautiful place. The end. And this is actually a headquarters book. From the author, though, it says, It often seems impossible for nature to thrive in a city of concrete and brick and steel, but the more I've traveled and the closer I've looked at the world around me, the more I realize that nature is always eagerly exploring the places we've forgotten. You can find flowers and fields and even small forests growing wild in every city. You just have to look for them. On the west side of Manhattan, there is an old elevated railway called the High Line. Its trains rumble high above the city streets for decades, but in 1980, the High Line was shut down and forgotten. Without people and trains getting in the way, nature was free to redecorate. Over the years, the rusty rails and gravel slowly gave way to wildflowers and trees, and if you look at the railway today, you'll see a lush garden that curves above the streets and between buildings. From grass bursting through the cracks in a sidewalk or a tuffet of goldenrods clinging to a brick wall, to a meadow winding along an abandoned railway, nature can thrive in the unlikeliest of places. All of this made me curious. What would happen if an entire city dedicated to truly cooperating with nature? How would that city change? How would it all begin? Peter Brown. And that's the end.